The Museum of Flight is the largest independent, non-profit air and space museum in the world. With over 175 aircraft and spacecraft, countless artifacts, millions of rare photographs, a world-class library, and numerous exhibits and experiences, the museum and its dedicated team of docents bring mankind's incredible history of flight to life. In this video, we will visit the Personal Courage Wing, the Space Gallery, and the Aviation Pavilion. Here you will see the camera used to take the first photographs of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Learn about the brave World War II women in aviation. See the very first 1914 fighter plane ever built, and climb inside a full-scale mock-up of the Space Shuttle orbiter. In the Aviation Pavilion, you can walk through a Concorde supersonic airplane, the first Air Force One jet, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, and the first 747 ever built.
This building is all about World War I and World War II. The main artifacts are the fighter aircraft that were used, but it's really mostly about the stories of people involved. It's kind of like, okay, meet this person, and by the way, this is the type of plane they flew. It's a way to engage with that period. In that way, I think it's a way that people can more relate to what those times were like, because no matter what country you're from, what your job was, everyone was pretty much wrapped up in the whole horrible business of war. And it's not about, we're not judging winners and losers in here. It's just, this is what it was like, and it's told from a few different perspectives. But ours, of course, is the aviation side. But when you look at them, it's sort of like, okay, doesn't matter who you are or where you are, flying an airplane demands certain skills. Your job has certain missions, and they're all kind of in common. So that's one of the things that I think exhibits like this can help people appreciate. And I've seen that so many times where people come in here and that they're not here because they like airplanes or something, but they can start looking at things that were actually worn by somebody, and then learning about a particular person. It's like, oh wait, he was Polish, and he flew for England. What's that story? So it makes people aware of something in a personal way. It's like, okay, why? Well, it's not because he was recruited. It's because his country was invaded, and he wanted to get back to that. He wanted to do what he can to liberate his country. So he escapes, gets to England, joins the Royal Air Force, because this is the type of plane that he would have flown, the British Spitfire. We've got a little bit of everything, British planes, the German planes, Japanese, war in Europe and the Pacific. This has an interesting background because this photographer, so he was an Army photographer, flying to Pearl Harbor when the attack happened. So he took the first photographs of that attack, and this is the camera that he used. Not all of the individuals were the ones that you would expect. There were Japanese Americans that fought in World War II for this country. This tells some of his story. And one of my favorite exhibits over here about the women Air Force service pilots. Another story that a lot of people didn't know about until fairly recently. You know, these ladies were flying literally everything in World War II. Their main job was delivering airplanes and also sometimes flying targets like this, which I think is kind of another kind of sexism, perhaps, because it's sort of like, okay, we'll let the girls fly the planes that we're going to be shooting at. And it was to train, you know, the guys how to shoot other airplanes down. They had to get their own uniforms. They had no military veteran benefits after the war. It really wasn't until 50 years later that they got formal recognition by Congress and they could finally accept, get veteran benefits. Most of them were dead by then, but at least the story is out. They had to fight for this involvement because there were so many guys who were just saying, they can't fly these big planes. It's like, how are they going to fit? They don't have the strength, and it's all that kind of stuff. Well, that didn't seem to be a problem at all. And where, like, let's say the average male pilot, okay, he gets accepted into flight school. He'll learn how to fly in a trainer, and then he'll move up to an advanced trainer, and then probably be assigned to either a fighter like this or one of the bombers, and that's what he's going to be flying for the remainder of that for the war. So not a lot of experience in some ways. You kind of specialize. Well, they had to fly everything. Their job was to go to the factories and to fly them to the different bases. So it could be one day they're flying a fighter, next day they're flying a trainer, day after that they're flying a bomber. The African American aviators, the first ones, the Tuskegee Airmen as they got to be known. We have some artifacts, a lot of them from this man right here, Bill Holloman, who lived in Seattle area. This is regarded as the very first fighter plane. So not like one of the, no, it's like this is the one, and they only made one. And it's not been restored. So that's why it's in this wonderful condition from 1914. So now it's well over 100 years old. And the history behind it is equally great. So, the Caproni family, Caproni aircraft in Italy, think of it as sort of like the Boeing family in a way. Early aviation, great family of aviation in Italy. And they proposed this as a fighter right at the beginning of World War I. But nobody else thought that something like that would be needed. They said, well, no, we don't see use for that for bomber. We want bombers. We want observation aircraft. That's what airplanes are for, right? Well, that obviously turned out to be wrong fairly quickly. But this is their proposal for a fighter aircraft. And when it was rejected, they just kept it in the family. So it stayed on the family estate for the next 80 years until they got to be friends with our curator at the time. And they said, we've had it long enough. It's time to share it with the rest of the world. And your museum would be a great place for it. So here we are. Once the plane was retired, because not everyone wants to fly around in an airplane that's got an 80-year-old engine in it, or the old instruments that no brakes and things like that. So it was pretty common for these replicas to have a more modern engine, perhaps, and some of the modern airplane parts that would keep them safe. So when they were retired, that was all replaced. So like now when you look at this, let's say the airplane was maybe made in the 1970s or 80s, but that's an engine from World War I. And you know, the instruments inside now have been changed back to World War I. So wherever possible, we've been able to make it as authentic as possible, as we can do it. I really like the early aviation. It's incredibly fascinating and in some ways almost unbelievable because things were happening so fast. There were so many changes. The people involved were like super people because they had to learn how to adapt. They didn't have all the answers yet. You know, and you can just see by looking at this stuff. Okay, there's 1 wings, 2 wings, you know, 3 wings. You know, let's try whatever works. And some things went in and out of fashion. And you know, some designs were fantastic and they were good and safe and everything. Others, not so. You look at these engines, they're so massive compared to, you know, the power that they got out of them. Compare it to, you know, the engine in your car, a third the size and a third the weight and much more power. Most of the time, the engine stays still and then it turns the prop, sort of like engines turn wheels on cars and stuff. Well, this one, the engine and the prop moved. And it worked very well. It had a good power to weight ratio and was reliable. So all those combinations when other engines weren't very reliable. There were slower turning props as well. Those things sped up. That ended the days of the rotary engine. This one dates back to the World War I as well. It is extensively restored. And the reason why it's uncovered like this is that during the restoration, you know, the person in charge who was kind of bankrolling the whole thing asked the people that were building it if it'd be okay to just stop because it looks so beautiful right now. You know, he's saying, do you mind if we don't fly this after all? Okay. So it makes a great exhibit. It shows all the detail. We are now in the Charles Simonyi Space Gallery, and whereas before we were looking at the space race and what happened in the long time past of spaceflight, this is more recent. So most of the exhibitry here is around the space shuttle program, but we also look at what's happening right now in space. So this is what NASA used to call the full fuselage trainer. So it is a full-scale mock-up of the space shuttle fuselage, no wings attached. But it was a trainer. It was at the Johnson Space Center in Building 9. NASA donated this to the museum, but getting it here was quite an operation. It had to be cut up into a few different pieces and then flown. We were able to fly it up on the NASA Super Capi. So that was fun. And then smaller parts were shipped up, trucked up But what's special about this, you know, it was used by all the shuttle astronauts, you know, so it was very well used, and we'll be offering public tours of the inside again. They were put on hold during COVID, and we've been making some changes since then. So, but we'll be having those tours again, and that's something that you can't do at other places. The inside here, the crew compartment, that area, cockpit, is essentially real shuttle equipment, and this is the only one that was extended for the full fuselage. And there are a number of reasons for that. They actually brought hardware into this before it was flown into space, just to make sure it's going to fit, you know, that kind of stuff. Concorde is just like a piece of art. I mean, it is such a gorgeous airplane, and they're unique. They were the only really operational supersonic airliner. And they're all rare. I mean, they never made very many. They made 20 total, and that includes the prototypes. There are only 14 that were used in the airlines. So it's quite a sight. And it's one of the planes that people come here to see, you know, simply for that reason. The only other one you're going to see in this part of the world, there's one in New York. You can go through most of the planes here, you know, Concorde, 747, Air Force One, got a Dreamliner, and the restorations on these are really incredible. Like that B-17 is probably the most authentic B-17 in the world. It's down to everything, like the ashtrays inside. It's like the airplane that came out of the factory in 1942. Most of the restoration work is done by volunteers, so it took over 20 years each on the B-17, the B-29, and restoration really begins on the inside and goes out. It's a lot of things that you'll never see, and things that nobody will ever see again unless they start taking off panels. Really popular. This was the first Air Force One jet, so it dates back to 1958. Eisenhower, so it was used by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. This one would probably fool most people because it's also very rare and it looks just like the plane that followed it. Looks like a DC-3. And everyone's familiar with DC-3s, but no, this is a DC-2. They only made a couple hundred of these. And this was one of the last in existence. I think there's only about 9 or 11 that exist anymore. And this one was the last one that was flyable. We were flying this up to the time that we retired it about 5-6 years ago. Anyone who is a true av geek, especially airline av geek, has to come here because they will see there's the first 727 right there. On the other side of the Dreamliner is the first 737. This is the first 747. And then, if numbers don't count that much, this is number 3 Dreamliner, 787. Number 3 was actually a very significant plane because it was used not only in the test program as a prototype, it was also the one that was fixed up on the inside that Boeing used to fly around the world to show off the new airplane and get some new buyers for it. So it had 2 lives. It was a test plane and then a show plane. The other thing that is so cool about having the planes out here like this is that we've seen a lot of these planes at the airport. You know, if you go to an airport now, you can go to see the Dreamliner out there, maybe even a 747, but you're never out with them. You're going through the little jetway and then you're in the cabin. So it's hard to get that sense of scale. As you can see, this is not the ordinary airliner. So it was never an airliner. It was always a test plane for Boeing. So it was always kept open like this. You can think of the engineering mind as like, why would we want to cover it up? It's just going to add weight. The only reason it's covered up is to make it look pretty. We don't care about that. We're a bunch of engineers. We have to do work here. It's not going to help our work. And it also helps in case you do want to see how things are working. You know, to certify it, you know, it has to prove to the FAA this is a safe airplane. So that part of the testing phase can be very detailed. They have to go through all kinds of scenarios, you know, how it stalls, how it behaves in different types of weather. Do the systems work? Are they reliable? Virtually everything. And that also helps develop things like pilot's manuals and how the plane is operated, because they're still figuring all that out in a way that has to be easy to figure out once it's in service. It's a huge airplane. It's got all kinds of room for test equipment. So let's say you want to test out new systems. You can plug them into this and see how they work in real flight conditions. And they were doing that all the way up until the 777 in the early 90s. They put the same engine that was going to be on the 777 on this plane. So that way they know the plane's going to fly on 3 engines normally, you know. So if something goes wrong with this new 777 engine, no big deal. But they just wanted to find out what it was going to fly like. You can do all kinds of testing on the ground, but there's a big difference, especially back then. Let's take it up to 30,000 feet, our cruising altitude, as if it's a real airline flight. And this plane sat unrestored for a long, long time, so it was really a big deal to be able to finally fix it up and open it to the public. First 737. So after Boeing used it as a test plane for about 4 or 5 years, and then sold it to NASA for about $1, and NASA used it for the next 20, 25 years for really cutting edge flight research. So a lot of things that are common on airliners today were first flown on that airplane. You know, things like GPS landings, LiDARs to find out what the weather is like. It's really pretty astonishing what was pioneered in that airplane.